She hired him. Not immediately. Not that first evening when he walked through the glass doors carrying a leather portfolio that had seen better days, his shirt pressed but fraying at the collar. Not when her assistant said there was someone here for the operations manager position, and she looked up to see David Carrington standing in the waiting area, visibly older, visibly smaller somehow, pretending he hadn't recognized her name on the company website. But she hired him. 3 weeks later, after 2 rounds of interviews he thought were with other people. This isn't fiction. This is what happens when the person who once made you feel incapable becomes the one who needs your capability to survive. The office smelled like new carpet and the particular kind of coffee that comes from machines worth more than most people's rent. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, and Miriam Chen was still at her desk because she always was. Not out of obligation anymore, but because she'd built something here that didn't require her to apologize for her competence. 14 years ago, David had told her she managed their home like a child organizing dolls. Now she managed 73 employees across 4 states, and nobody questioned whether she'd remember to pay the mortgage. Her assistant had already gone home. The floor was mostly empty, except for the custodial staff moving quietly between cubicles, emptying bins, straightening chairs. The building made its evening sounds, the hum of the HVAC system cycling down, the distant ping of an elevator, the soft buzz of exit signs that never darkened. She was reviewing Q3 projections when Rebecca from HR forwarded the application with a note. Credentials look solid. Overqualified, actually. Thoughts? She opened the PDF. His name appeared first, and the world became briefly, perfectly still. David Carrington, bachelor's in supply chain management, 15 years of logistics experience. Recently left his position at Harman & Fitch due to departmental restructuring. Available immediately. References available upon request. She read it 3 times. Then she looked at his photo, professional, neutral, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had more gray at his temples. The confidence he used to wear like armor had thinned into something that looked like careful politeness. There were lines around his mouth that hadn't been there before, a softness to his jaw that suggested either weight loss or simply time doing what time does. She didn't remember closing the file. She only remembered the sound of her own breathing in the quiet office, steady and even, while her hands stayed folded on the desk. Outside her window, the city was turning gold with sunset, the glass towers catching light and throwing it back at each other like a conversation she couldn't hear. That night, she didn't tell anyone. Not her sister. Not the friends who'd helped her move her boxes into a studio apartment she could barely afford, while he kept the house, the car, the dog, and the certainty that she'd come crawling back within a month. She sat in her kitchen, the 3rd kitchen she'd lived in since him, the one with the marble counters she'd chosen herself, and drank tea that went cold while she tried to remember the last time she'd thought about him for more than a passing moment. It had been years, whole years. She'd stopped checking his social media after the first 18 months, stopped wondering if he ever regretted it, stopped needing him to. And now his resume was in her inbox, asking for her mercy in the language of professional qualifications. Before, there had been a version of their life that looked like anyone else's. A townhouse in a suburb with good schools they'd never need. Dinner at 7, usually something she cooked while he watched the news with the volume too loud. Weekend routines that included grocery stores and home improvement projects that never quite finished. They'd been together since she was 24, married at 27, separated at 31. He was older by 6 years. That had mattered to her once. It made him seem certain about things, like he'd already figured out the answers to questions she was still learning to ask. He had opinions about everything. The best route to the airport, the correct way to load a dishwasher, how much money she should or shouldn't spend on herself. She'd mistaken his rigidity for wisdom. Then she mistook his criticism for care. "You're not strategic," he used to say, as if it were a diagnosis. "You think in the moment. You don't see the larger picture." He said it when she suggested they move closer to the city, when she proposed switching jobs, when she stayed late at her entry-level operations coordinator position. Learning systems, he said, didn't matter. "You're spinning your wheels, Miriam. That company's going nowhere." She heard him say it even now, sometimes, when she stood in front of the board, delivering quarterly reports. The company had gone public 2 years ago. In the marriage, she'd learned to make herself quieter. She stopped bringing up promotions at dinner, stopped mentioning the projects her manager praised. When she did share good news, His response was always the same measured nod, followed by a correction or a caveat. That's great, but don't let it go to your head. Middle management is where most people plateau. She'd believed him because he seemed so sure, because he'd been working in logistics since before they met. And she was still figuring out the difference between net and gross profit. Because when someone tells you repeatedly that you're not quite smart enough, not quite capable enough, eventually you start to believe them. Their bedroom had been painted a pale gray that he'd chosen. She'd wanted yellow. He said yellow was too childish, too bright, that she'd tire of it. The gray was sensible. The gray was mature. She'd wake up every morning to that gray and feel it, settling over her like fog. There were good moments too, of course. There had to be. Evenings when he'd come home with takeout from the Thai place she liked. Sunday mornings reading separate sections of the newspaper in comfortable silence. The way he'd warm her car in winter, starting it remotely before she left for work. These small kindnesses existed alongside the constant erosion of her confidence, and for years she'd told herself that was what marriage was. Learning to live in the contradictions. There had been no single large betrayal, no affair discovered through a text message or a suspicious receipt. Their marriage had ended the way ice melts, slowly, then all at once. He didn't leave for someone else. He left because he decided she wasn't enough, and that the life they'd built was a compromise he no longer wanted to make. It happened on a Sunday in March. She was folding laundry in the bedroom when he came in and said, very calmly, that he'd been thinking, that maybe they'd made a mistake, that maybe they wanted different things, that maybe she'd be happier without him. She didn't cry, not then. She'd looked at him standing in the doorway, holding a coffee mug with both hands, the blue ceramic one with the chip on the rim that they'd bought on their honeymoon, and said, "Is this really what you want?" "I think it's best." "For who?" He'd hesitated, then, "For both of us." She remembered folding the last towel, pale blue, from the set his mother gave them, and setting it on the bed. The room smelled like lavender detergent. The afternoon light slanted across the floor in a way that made everything look softer than it was. In that moment, she'd felt something strange. Not devastation, but clarity. As if she'd been waiting for this, expecting it, and now that it had arrived, she could finally stop bracing for impact. "Okay," she'd said. He'd seemed surprised, maybe disappointed, as if he'd expected her to fight harder for something he'd already decided to abandon. "Just like that? What do you want me to say, David? That I'll change? That I'll be different?" "I want you to care." "I do care. I also know you. When you've made up your mind about something, there's no point in arguing." He'd set the mug down on the dresser, didn't look at her. "I thought you'd be upset." "I am upset. I'm also tired." That had been true. She'd been so tired. Tired of measuring her words, of second-guessing her instincts, of feeling like a guest in her own life. They divided everything neatly over the next 3 months. Lawyers, paperwork, a mediation session where they sat across from each other like strangers negotiating a contract. He'd been reasonable about most of it, generous even. He didn't need to take the furniture, he said. He knew she couldn't afford to replace it. "Take what you want," she'd told him. "I don't need any of it." In the end, she'd left with her clothes, her books, a single box of photographs she'd never look at again, and a settlement that covered 2 months' rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were background music. The last time she saw him, he was standing in the driveway as the moving truck pulled away. He'd said, "Take care of yourself, Miriam. I mean that." She'd believed him. She'd also believed she'd never see him again. What he'd said as she got into her car, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, was the thing that stayed with her. "You're going to struggle without someone to help you think things through. Call me if you need advice." She never called. The application sat in her email for 3 days before she responded. In that time, she considered every version of what she could do. She could reject him outright. She could forward it to someone else. She could schedule the interview herself and watch him realize in real time that the girl who couldn't see the larger picture was now the one deciding his future. Instead, she asked Rebecca to handle the first interview. Standard protocol. Rebecca didn't know David, didn't know their history. She scheduled him like any other candidate. Miriam watched the calendar invitation appear in her shared folder. October 18th, 2:12 p.m. She wouldn't be there, but she'd see the notes afterward. She went about her week with a strange sense of removed curiosity. In meetings, she found herself distracted by thoughts of what he might say, how he might present himself, whether he'd mention knowing her. She'd built something here, not just a department, but a reputation. People respected her, they sought her input. When she spoke, rooms quieted to listen. Would he understand that? Would he see it? Rebecca's summary arrived that evening. Strong technical skills, possibly overqualified, but willing to take lateral entry. Seemed a bit nervous, but handled questions well. Spoke intelligently about supply chain optimization and vendor management. Took notes during our conversation, which I thought was a nice touch. Recommend second round. There was no mention of him asking about her. No indication he'd admitted he knew who ran the department. She read the notes 3 times, looking for something between the lines. Hesitation, recognition, any hint that he'd revealed their connection. But Rebecca's assessment was purely professional. Whatever David had felt sitting in that conference room, he'd kept it to himself. She approved the second interview, this time with Gerard, her senior operations lead, a man whose judgment she trusted completely, who knew her well enough to recognize when she was carrying something heavy, but kind enough not to ask why. Gerard's assessment was shorter, solid, no red flags, understands the technical side. Could use some updating on current software, but he's clearly capable. A bit formal, maybe, had that old-school corporate vibe, but he listened well and asked good questions. You should meet him. The phrase old-school corporate vibe made her smile despite herself. That was David exactly, holding on to a way of doing business that was already becoming obsolete when they were married, still wearing ties to interviews when everyone else had moved to business casual. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday at 4 p.m. She arrived at the conference room early and sat in the chair at the head of the table. The room was all glass and pale wood, the kind of space designed to communicate transparency and control. Outside the windows, the city stretched out in clean lines, 20 stories below. She could see the building where she'd worked when they were married, a squat brown structure in the distance, where she'd sat in a gray cubicle, processing inventory reports while he told her she'd never advance. When he walked in, she didn't stand. He froze in the doorway. Just for a second, a half-breath, a stumble in his composure. And then he recovered. Miriam. David. He closed the door carefully, as if it might shatter. Then he sat down across from her, placing his portfolio on the table with both hands. His wedding ring was gone, she noticed. That surprised her. He'd always said he'd wear it forever, even after divorce. That it meant something about commitment, about honoring what had been. She wondered when he'd stopped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She let the silence settle. Let him sit with it. Let him understand that she wasn't going to make this easy by pretending they were strangers. The air conditioning hummed. Someone laughed in a distant hallway. The ordinary sounds of a workplace where extraordinary things sometimes happened. I didn't know you worked here, he said finally. Not until after I applied. And yet you didn't withdraw your application. No. Why not? He looked down at his hands, hands she'd held once, hands that had touched her face, her hair, that had packed boxes and signed divorce papers and opened doors she couldn't reach. Because I need the job. The honesty surprised her. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe David had always been honest, just only about the things that mattered to him. She opened the folder in front of her. His resume, printed. The same document she'd been staring at for 2 weeks. She'd made notes in the margins, questions she'd written and then erased, unable to separate the professional from the personal. You left Harmon and Fitch. They restructured the entire logistics division. I was part of the cut. How long were you there? 11 years. She nodded slowly, made a note she didn't need to make. And before that? You know before that. She looked up, met his eyes. I'm conducting an interview, David. Answer the question. His jaw tightened, but he complied. He walked her through his work history, his qualifications, his strengths. He was good. She'd forgotten that, or maybe never fully appreciated it. He understood systems, logistics, efficiency. He spoke about supply chains and vendor relationships with the same confidence he'd once used to tell her she was being impractical. But there was something different now, a carefulness, a humility that hadn't existed before. He asked if she wanted him to clarify points. He admitted when he wasn't familiar with certain software platforms they used. I'd need some training on those systems. he said. But I learn quickly. She remembered him refusing to learn new programs at his old job, insisting the ones he knew were sufficient, that companies changed platforms too often and it was a waste of time to keep up. She'd suggested once that his resistance to learning might limit his options. He'd told her she didn't understand how the industry worked. When he finished, she set down her pen. Why this position? You're overqualified. I'm also unemployed. You could find something at your level. I've been looking for 8 months. His voice was quiet. This is the first place that called me back. The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way he looked past her rather than at her. The market's changed, he continued. Everything's younger, faster. They want people who grew up with this technology, who can code and analyze data and do 3 jobs at once for half the salary. He stopped, started again. I'm not what they're looking for anymore. She studied him, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders curved inward just slightly, like he'd learned to make himself smaller. There was a worn quality to him now, a tiredness that went deeper than a bad job search. You're aware I'd be your direct supervisor? Yes. And you're comfortable with that? He hesitated, then. I don't have the luxury of being uncomfortable. That's not an answer. No, it's not. He met her gaze. The truth is, I don't know if I'm comfortable with it. But I know I need work, and I know that whatever happened between us, you're fair. You always were, even when I wasn't. The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, unexpected and heavy. She didn't tell him that day. She thanked him for his time, told him they'd be in touch, watched him stand and gather his things, watched him pause at the door as if he wanted to say something else, then decide against it. After he left, she sat alone in the conference room until the automatic lights dimmed, triggered by the lack of movement. The city outside had turned from afternoon gold to evening blue. Somewhere below, David was probably walking to his car, wondering if he'd just destroyed his last good option for employment, or if maybe, impossibly, she might give him a chance. That night, she called her sister. He applied to work for you. Elena's voice pitched upward. The same man who said you'd never make it without him? The same. And you're actually considering hiring him? Miriam looked out her apartment window. The city glowed against the October dark, 1,000 lit windows holding 1,000 private worlds. She'd moved here 4 years ago, to this building with its rooftop garden and its doorman who knew her name. It was nothing like the studio she'd started in, nothing like the modest one-bedroom that came after. This was the kind of place David used to say she'd never be able to afford on her own. I don't know yet. Mir, you don't owe him anything. I know. So why are you even thinking about it? She didn't have an answer, or she had too many. The truth was complicated. Part of her wanted to reject him outright, to give him the same dismissal he'd once given her dreams, but another part, the part that had built a career on seeing people's potential rather than their current limitations, recognized that he was qualified, that he could do the job well, that her personal history with him didn't change his professional capabilities. And there was something else, something smaller and more human that she didn't want to admit even to herself. She wanted him to see what she'd become, not to gloat, not to prove him wrong exactly, but to simply know, to understand in a concrete, daily, unavoidable way that she had been capable all along. I'm going to think about it, she told Elena. Her sister sighed. Just promise me you're doing this for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? I don't know, but revenge disguised as professionalism probably isn't one of them. After they hung up, Miriam sat with that thought. Was this revenge? It didn't feel like it. Revenge would be hot, satisfying, immediate. This felt like something colder and more complex, a decision that wouldn't resolve anything but might at least provide clarity. The decision came slowly, across weeks that felt like months. She interviewed 2 other candidates, both qualified, both safe. Neither carried the weight of memory or the strange satisfaction of watching someone who'd once diminished her sit across a desk asking for her approval. The first candidate was a woman in her 30s, bright and eager, fresh from a company that had gone under. She'd be grateful for the opportunity. She'd work hard. She'd never make Miriam question her own judgment. The second was younger, a recent MBA with impressive analytics skills, but no real-world experience. He'd need training, mentoring, time to grow into the role. Either one would be fine. Neither one would keep her awake at night, wondering if she was making a decision based on competence or something more complicated. Gerard asked her gently if she wanted to talk about it. "He's qualified," she said. "That's not what I'm asking." They were in her office, late afternoon, the golden hour when the light came through her window at an angle that made everything look warmer than it was. She'd looked at him, this man who'd worked beside her for 6 years, who'd seen her build this department from chaos into something functional and respected, and said, "I don't know what I want." Then maybe that's your answer. But it wasn't. She went home that night and pulled out the box of photographs she told herself she'd thrown away, but had actually just buried in the back of her closet. There they were, David at 29, confident and laughing. Their wedding, smaller than she'd wanted, exactly the size he'd thought appropriate. Vacations to places he'd chosen. The two of them in front of the townhouse, his arm around her shoulder, her smile just a little too tight. She looked at these images of a woman who seemed like a stranger now. Younger, quieter, perpetually seeking approval that never quite came, and she thought about the man who'd sat across from her in the conference room, diminished and humbled and asking for a chance. People changed. She had. Maybe he had too. Or maybe this was just the universe offering her a choice, to be the kind of person who punished past wrongs, or to be someone who recognized that complexity and contradiction could exist in the same space. She put the photos back, made herself dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat on her balcony watching the city lights bloom against the gathering dark. By the time she went to bed, she knew what she would do. She hired him on a Monday morning in early November, sent the offer letter herself. Didn't call, just emailed, professional and clean. Salary, benefits, start date, everything fair, everything appropriate. The salary was market rate for the position. Not a penny more or less. She wouldn't punish him, but she wouldn't give him preferential treatment either. He accepted within 2 hours. His response was brief. "Thank you for this opportunity. I won't disappoint you." She read that line several times. The presumption in it, that disappointing her was still something that mattered, that her opinion held weight in his life. But also the humility, the recognition that he'd been given something he didn't necessarily deserve. His first day, she wasn't in the office. She'd scheduled herself for a site visit 3 hours away, something she'd planned weeks ago, but that now felt conveniently timed. Gerard walked him through onboarding, showed him his desk, a cubicle in the middle of the floor, nothing special, the kind of space she'd once occupied, introduced him to the team. When she returned the next day, he was already there, seated in the far corner of the operations floor, head down, working through system protocols. He was wearing a navy suit, more formal than anyone else in the office. She watched him for a moment from her office doorway, this man who'd once told her she was impractical, now taking careful notes like a student learning a new language. She didn't go over immediately. She made coffee, checked her messages, let the morning settle into routine. When she finally walked past his desk, he looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Nothing else. No acknowledgement of the strangeness, no gratitude or resentment. Just two people existing in the same space, pretending the past was something that had happened to different versions of themselves. The weeks folded into each other. He was good at the job, better than good, efficient, thorough, exactly what they needed. He asked smart questions, integrated quickly, stayed late when projects demanded it, but never made a show of his effort. She watched him learn their systems, watched him adapt to a workplace culture that was less hierarchical than what he was used to. He struggled at first with the informality, the way people walked into each other's offices without appointments, the collaborative approach to problem solving. But he adjusted. He listened more than he spoke. He took direction without defensiveness. They didn't speak beyond what was necessary. Progress updates, project questions, the occasional meeting where they sat at opposite ends of the table and addressed the room rather than each other. The team didn't know, or if they suspected, they were kind enough not to ask. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the office was quiet, she'd glance over and see him staring at his screen with an expression she recognized, the same focused intensity he used to have when solving problems at home, the dishwasher that wouldn't drain, the fence that needed mending. There had been a competence to him once, before the marriage turned it into a weapon he used to diminish her. Once, she caught him looking at her. She'd been standing by the window in her office, phone to her ear, closing a deal with a vendor who'd been playing hardball for weeks. She'd negotiated them down 15%, and when she hung up, she'd felt that particular satisfaction of knowing she'd won without anyone losing face. When she turned, David was visible through her glass wall, standing by his desk, watching her. He'd glanced away immediately, but not before she saw something in his face she couldn't name. Not regret exactly. Maybe recognition. It was Rebecca who asked, 3 months in, during a lunch they'd taken off-site. "You and David," Miriam looked up from her salad. "What about us?" "You never talk to each other." "Not really. It's polite, but it's strange. Like you're performing professionalism rather than just being professional." "We're careful." "You're careful." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying her. "I'm not trying to pry, if there's something I should know." "There isn't." Miriam set down her fork, wiped her mouth with her napkin, buying herself a moment. "We knew each other a long time ago. It didn't end well, but that's not relevant to his work." "How long ago?" "Does it matter?" "I guess not." Rebecca paused. "He's good at his job." "I know." "And you're fair with him. Maybe more fair than you'd be with someone else." That stopped her. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're harder on everyone else. You push them, challenge them, expect more. With him, you're careful. Like you're trying so hard not to show favoritism that you're almost showing it in reverse." Miriam hadn't thought about it that way. But Rebecca was right. She did hold back with David, not in giving him assignments or evaluating his work, but in the casual interactions that made up a workday. She didn't joke with him the way she did with others, didn't stop by his desk to chat, didn't include him in the after-work drinks that had become a monthly tradition. "I don't want people to think I'm treating him differently because of our history." "So you treat him differently because of your history?" "That's not—" She stopped, laughed, despite herself. "Okay, point taken." Rebecca smiled. "For what it's worth, I don't think anyone's noticed, except maybe him." The confrontation came, eventually, the way these things always do, not as explosion, but as erosion, the slow wearing away of a boundary neither of them had agreed to maintain forever. It was late March, a year since he'd started. The team was working on a system migration that had everyone stretched thin, and she'd stayed after hours to troubleshoot a vendor issue that couldn't wait until morning. When she finally looked up, the office was dark, except for her desk and one other, David's. She walked over slowly, her heels loud in the empty space. He was staring at his screen, the blue glow illuminating the exhaustion on his face. There was a coffee cup beside him, empty except for the dried ring at the bottom. "Go home," she said. He didn't look up. "Almost done." "It can wait until morning. I want to finish." "David." "I'm fine." She pulled over a chair, sat down beside him. Not close, but not distant either. Close enough to see the spreadsheet he was working on, the careful color coding, the notes he'd added in the margins. "You're not fine. You look exhausted." "I said I'm fine. And I'm saying go home." He finally looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, shadows beneath them that spoke of nights without sleep. "I can't afford to fall behind." "You're not behind. You're ahead. You're always ahead." "That's not how it feels." She studied him, the defensiveness in his posture, the way his hands had curled into fists on the desk. This wasn't about the project. It was about something deeper, some fear he'd been carrying since the day he walked through the door. "What's going on?" "Nothing." "David!" He laughed, short and bitter. "You really want to know?" "I wouldn't ask if I didn't." He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. "I'm terrified. Every single day. That I'll make a mistake, that you'll realize hiring me was a bad idea, that I'll prove everyone right who said I was past my prime." "Everyone?" "Recruiters, hiring managers, the 27 companies that rejected me before this one." He paused. "You know what they say? They say I'm not a cultural fit. They say I'm overqualified. What they mean is I'm old and they don't want to pay me what I'm worth." She heard the bitterness in his voice, the exhaustion. and beneath it the fear. You're not too old. I'm 52, Miriam. In this industry, that's ancient. You're experienced. That's not the same thing. Try telling that to the 25-year-old doing the hiring. They sat in silence. Outside, the city hummed its constant low song, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its towers. You don't have to prove anything, she said finally. He turned to look at her. Don't I? Not to me. Then to who? Maybe to yourself. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Why did you really apply here? She asked. The question she'd been carrying for a year, never quite finding the right moment to ask it. He closed his laptop, leaned back, looked at the ceiling tiles, water stained and yellowing in the corners. I told you, I needed work. You could have gone anywhere. You could have kept looking until someone offered you a director position. Why here? Why me? I went everywhere. No one wanted me. He paused. When I saw your company listed, I almost didn't apply. I saw your name and I thought, she'll never hire me. She has every reason to hate me. But then I looked at the website, saw what you'd built, read about the company culture, the growth, the awards, and I thought, he stopped, started again. I thought maybe you'd be fair, even after everything, because that's who you've always been, even when I couldn't see it. Fair? Or maybe I thought you'd reject me outright, and at least then I'd know. At least then I'd stop wondering if I'd completely destroyed every bridge I ever had. She sat with that, the admission of it, the vulnerability. I didn't expect mercy, he said. Is that what you think this is? Isn't it? She considered. The city outside was infinite with light, each window a story, each story a collection of small decisions that added up to a life. I hired you because you were qualified, she said. Not because I pitied you, and not because I wanted revenge. Then why? She didn't know how to answer. Or she did, but the truth was complicated in ways she hadn't let herself examine until now. You told me I'd never manage without you, she said quietly. Do you remember that? He closed his eyes. Yes. You said I didn't think strategically, that I was impulsive, that I'd crash and burn the first time things got hard. Miriam, I'm not angry anymore. I haven't been for years. But when I saw your application, I realized I wanted you to see what I became, not to gloat, just to know, to understand that you were wrong, that maybe I'd been capable all along, and you just couldn't see it because it threatened something in you. The words hung between them, years of hurt compressed into a few quiet sentences. I was wrong about a lot of things, he said finally. I know. I was cruel. Yes. I was afraid. She looked at him. Afraid of what? Of you. Of what you might become if I stopped trying to control it. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Isn't that pathetic? I was so terrified of being left behind that I spent years trying to keep you small, and then you left anyway, and you became exactly what I was afraid you'd become, someone who didn't need me at all. She'd never heard him say any of this. Through the divorce, through all the mediated conversations and legal negotiations, he'd been calm, reasonable, never quite admitting fault. This honesty was new, or maybe it had always been there, and she'd been too hurt to hear it. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for all of it, for making you doubt yourself, for leaving when things got hard, for telling you you weren't enough when the truth was I was terrified of how much you were. The apology was so quiet she almost missed it, and when she looked at him, really looked, she saw someone who'd already been carrying the weight of those words for longer than she'd realized. Thank you, she said. They sat there for a while longer, not reconciled exactly, but no longer holding the past quite so tightly. Eventually she stood. Go home, David. Get some sleep. The project will still be here tomorrow. He nodded, began packing his things slowly, deliberately, as if each action required conscious thought. As he was putting on his coat, he said without looking at her, For what it's worth, you built something remarkable here. I know. He smiled, small, genuine, sad. Yeah, I guess you do. They didn't become friends. The history was too deep, the scar tissue too thick. But over time, the carefulness softened into something more natural. They worked well together, learned to communicate without the weight of old resentments turning every word into subtext. She started including him in team lunches. He started offering suggestions in meetings without the defensive posture he'd carried those first months. They developed a working rhythm that felt, if not comfortable, at least functional. There were still awkward moments. The time someone made a joke about workplace romances, and they'd both suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. The day she'd mentioned being out sick and he'd started to ask if she needed anything, then stopped himself, remembering they weren't those people to each other anymore. But there were good moments too. The project they collaborated on that came in ahead of schedule and under budget. The time he'd spotted an error in a vendor contract that would have cost them thousands, and she'd publicly thanked him in the team meeting. The slow, careful rebuilding of professional respect that had nothing to do with their past and everything to do with their present capabilities. 6 months after their late-night conversation, David was invited to present at an industry conference. It was a significant opportunity, the kind of visibility that could lead to better things. He'd asked Miriam to review his presentation. They'd sat in the conference room going through his slides, and she'd been impressed, despite herself. He'd adapted. He was talking about modern logistics solutions, cloud-based systems, data analytics, all the things he used to dismiss as passing trends. "This is good," she'd said. "Really good. I had a good teacher. Gerard? You?" He'd pulled up a slide showing supply chain optimization. "I've been watching how you work, how you think through problems. You were right. I was stuck in old patterns. I didn't want to admit the industry had changed, that I needed to change with it." She'd felt something shift in that moment. Not forgiveness exactly. She'd stopped needing to forgive him a long time ago. But something like understanding, a recognition that people could be both terrible and trying, that growth didn't erase harm, but it might be enough to exist alongside it. He stayed for 2 years, long enough to rebuild his reputation, his confidence, his resume, long enough that when a director position opened at a firm across town, one that was genuinely right for him, that recognized his experience as an asset rather than a liability. She wrote him a recommendation letter that was honest and warm. "David Carrington has been an invaluable member of our operations team," she wrote. "His technical expertise, combined with his willingness to adapt and grow, makes him an ideal candidate for leadership roles. He brings both experience and humility to his work, a rare and valuable combination." His last day was a Friday in June. The team threw him a small party in the break room. Cake from the bakery down the street, cards, the usual rituals of professional goodbye. People gave short speeches about projects they'd worked on together, inside jokes that had developed, things they'd learned from him. Miriam stood at the back, watching. He looked happy, lighter, somehow, than he'd been when he'd first walked through their doors 2 years ago. The fear that had lived in his shoulders had eased. He laughed at someone's joke, genuine and unself-conscious. When everyone else had filtered away, he came to her office. "I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to." "I do." He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. He'd finally stopped wearing suits every day, had adopted the business casual that everyone else preferred. "You could have ruined me. You had every reason to." "That's not who I am." "I know. That's why I'm grateful." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Okay." "Did you ever forgive me, really?" She thought about it, about the night he left, about the studio apartment and the years that followed, about the woman she'd become in his absence, and the strange peace she'd made with the fact that his cruelty had forced her to discover her own strength. "I don't think forgiveness works the way we want it to," she said. "I stopped being angry. I stopped needing an apology, but I never forgot what it felt like to be told I wasn't enough. That doesn't go away just because someone says they're sorry." "I should have been better." "Yes, you should have." She stood, walked around the desk. "But you're different now, and so am I. Maybe that's enough." He nodded, extended his hand. She shook it, firm, professional, final. "Take care of yourself, David." "You too, Miriam. And thank you for everything, for seeing past who I was to who I might become." She watched him leave from her office window, watched him cross the parking lot, get into a car that was newer than the one he'd driven before, and pull away into the evening traffic. A few people waved as he passed. He waved back. Then she turned back to her desk, to the projections, the schedules, the 1,000 small details that made up her days, to the life she'd built, not in spite of him, not because of him, but simply because it was hers to build. That night, she went home to her apartment, made dinner, pasta with the good olive oil she'd learned to splurge on, sat on her balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city lights bloom against the gathering dark. She thought about mercy, about revenge, about the strange satisfaction of discovering that neither one had ever been the point. The point had been to build something that was hers, to prove, not to him, but to herself, that she'd been capable all along, that the voice telling her she wasn't smart enough, strategic enough in any way had been wrong. Not because he'd admitted it, not because she'd made him watch her succeed, but because she'd done the work anyway, in the quiet spaces where no one was watching, where there was no audience to perform for and no judge to convince. She'd hired him because she could, because she was in a position to make that choice, and she'd chosen grace over bitterness, not for him, for herself, because holding on to anger would have required carrying him with her into every new thing she built. And she'd decided years ago that he didn't get to live in her future. The air was warm. Somewhere below, the city moved through its Friday night rhythms, people laughing, arguing, falling in love, falling apart, making the 1,000 small decisions that would determine who they became. She finished her wine, went inside, looked at her reflection in the dark window, a woman she'd built from the ground up, piece by piece, in the years after someone told her she'd never manage. She was managing just fine. Forgiveness came later, disguised as indifference. And peace arrived quietly, in the knowledge that his leaving had given her permission to become more than he'd ever believed she could be.